Before we begin today's interview with Theo Mseka, a quick word about our sponsor, PropTex. Simply put, PropTex helps real estate websites to be more engaging. And I guess we all know that becoming more engaging is the name of the game in our industry. Their technology allows users to play around with the listing directly on the website and basically imagine a renovation, putting their own furniture in, all things like that, which is obviously great for lead enhancement and for engagement metrics. But as a real estate portal, this could also bring you another revenue stream in the form of kind of embedded e-commerce and shopping. If that sounds good, you can, obviously go to proptex with 2x's.com or look the guys up on LinkedIn and say that we sent you, obviously. On to the interview now with Theo Mseka. It's a good one. Hello and welcome to the PPW pod, bringing you news, views and interviews from the world of real estate marketplaces and PropTech. My name is Edmund Keith. I'm the editor of onlinemarketplaces.com, joined as always today by Simon Baker. How are you, Simon?
I'm very well, thanks, Ed. It's great to see you, and Theo, fantastic to chat with you today. And I've known Theo for a very long time, and it's going to be a great chat.
Yep. We are joined today by Theo Mseka, joining us from South Africa. Theo is the CEO of Private Property. He is also, I think, the man responsible for building more real estate portals around the world than just about anybody else. How are you doing, Theo?
I'm doing fantastic, sitting in sunny Joburg today, and excited to be part of this podcast. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, you were top of the list of guests that we wanted to get on, or at least on my list of guests I wanted to get on, because you have built so many real estate portals around the world. You are, I'd go as far to say, an OG of the real estate portal game. Actually, I'm going to run down, for people who don't recognize Theo, I'm going to run down your career a little bit, because you've got one of those careers where if we were to go through all of it, we'd be here for 5-10 minutes. So you've been working in tech businesses and kind of things around tech for the last kind of 24, 25 years. You, looking at your LinkedIn before this, you were one of the people who helped build the ticketing system for the World Cup in South Africa. You built an AVM, I think South Africa's maybe first AVM, my agent. You worked at Auto Trader South Africa. You were one of the first employees of Property 24, the kind of big NASPA's owned property portal in South Africa for like 10 years. You then launched a bunch of real estate portals for NASPA's all around the world. You then went to Turkey and you led Hepsi Emlak, which back then was called Hurriyet Emlak, in, I think, 2022. And now you are back in South Africa and you are the CEO of Private Property. That's quite a career. Did I get all of that right?
Yeah, thanks, Edmund. There's a lot, and I've worked in a few continents and mostly real estate, but I've done autos too. And it's good to go full circle and, be back in South Africa competing with my former colleagues, which is quite nice. But yeah, it's been a fun ride working in real estate for so long.
Yeah, I want to start with your background quickly. So you built an AVM back in 2002. Now, I can't begin to imagine the complexities of building an AVM. There's probably all kinds of things that go into it. How difficult was building an AVM in South Africa in 2002? How much data was there, and just how difficult was that?
Well, it was very difficult. I'd say it's still probably quite difficult to build one in South Africa now. I mean, the tooling has gotten a lot better, with the growth in AI and those kinds of technologies that are helping businesses to be able to move a lot faster, and algorithms have gotten smarter. But, 20 years ago, 22, 23 years ago, when we started, it was really hard to get the data. The title deed office didn't have APIs when we first started, and we initially were getting data directly from the municipalities, which we were collecting, their transfer information on CDs and then having to kind of import it into our data structure and put it into our database. Getting the mapping, this was way before, for example, Google Maps existed. I think Google Maps launched in September of 2004. So being able to build a map-based tool, we had to build our own kind of mapping engine, built out the OpenJS Consortium's database, infrastructure, So it was a lot harder back then, I think, to do things that you could probably do in a tenth of the time now, given the advancement in technology. So it was difficult. And then getting people to understand what we were doing was the second challenge, because trying to predict future pricing based on historical data is something that was hard to kind of explain at the time. But, it helped the businesses that I was a part of in the early years there to kind of get going, because once people understood they could get value on a property without having to go and do a manual valuation, they then started to adopt these technologies. And then soon after we launched, many others appeared, and perfected that and did it a bit better. But I think now, 20 years later, there's a lot easier ways, faster ways, and cheaper ways of doing that.
Okay. So building an AVM, then going to work for Property 24. In doing my research for this, I saw somewhere that Property 24, the kind of big NASPA's owned real estate portal in South Africa, was, when you started, a 70+% margin business. Now I'm thinking, how? Surely it's not making 70% margins now, right? Like, how quickly did that business grow, and was it really making 70% margins?
Now, I'd say back then it wasn't making 70% margins. I think it took a concerted effort from very smart individuals. The guys that bought Property 24, it was a deal where they bought Property 24 from NASPA's bought them. And ultimately, it took about 3-4 years of rebuilding the business from the ground up before it became profitable. And I'd say it probably reached those kinds of margins you're speaking about around 2015, 2016. So probably the last 9 years. And as far as I know, the number is a little bit higher than 70, but somewhere around there. So, really good operation, cost management, very, very solid. They do a lot of things themselves, very little support from third parties, tooling, etc. So they run very lean, and that's worked for them. Built a strong brand that, is well recognized in the market. And so they don't have to spend too much on marketing. So it's a good moat, but, we know how to undo some of the damage that I was part of building,
That actually raises sort of an interesting question, which I'm sure you've got somewhere on the list, Ed. But I want to dive into that now. It's a good point, right? You've taken over running private property, and you're competing against your old team, okay, in many ways, or at least the old company. How useful is that sort of experience of working on both sides in shaping your strategy and how you're thinking about, trying to take on that market leader?
Yeah, so there's, you pull from the experiences, right? So we've tried different models because as a number two with a very dominant player, you need to have decent pricing strategies and growth strategies. So how to penetrate a specific market at a time. And you can't just spray and pray and hope that you get every agency on board. So you have to do it, systematically and grow in it in a market by market, micro market by market. So yeah, utilizing the experience, it's really good to have benefited from working there and understanding the DNA, because you kind of get a sense of how they will react to certain things in the market. But of course, as people move on, the DNA changes. You just have to, as a number two player, I believe, put blinkers on and follow your strategy, run your race, not worry too much about what market leader's doing.
So that raises the question of how are you approaching the game differently? I mean, there's no use just being a total photocopy of what they're doing. So what is it you're doing differently? How are you thinking about solving the problem?
Well, the problem is that, you need to be able to provide value to the customer base, which is largely estate agents that are listing properties on the platform. So our aim is to reach a unique audience that our main the competitor in the market isn't able to reach, and provide unique leads. And we're successfully doing that so far. Of course, as we grow more, we'll start reaching the same kind of audience that the market leader has, and then we have to compete head on user experience. We believe that we are on the right track around that. Part of our challenge is we've had to rebuild the business from the ground up. It wasn't really looked after in a great way previously. And so literally everything we're rebuilding from the ground up. And as a result, we're doing a bit of catching up before we can do some differentiation and starting to add features that make us unique in the market. But that period will come. And for now, we're just pressing on with our blinkers on and not worrying too much about, what they're doing on their side.
Now, I may get this wrong, but Better Homes is the owner or one of the shareholders. And do you want to talk a bit about the Better Homes Group and how that plays in? Because that would be an interesting relationship and that must help you in the market.
I think there's benefit to it. Our core shareholders is Better Home Group as well as Uber. And Uber is one of the leading mortgage origination businesses in the country. And Better Home owns a mortgage origination company called Better Bond. So, in this market, you either go very deep in search, and then you start to branch out and look at ancillary and peripheral business, which is what our competitor is doing. They're doing that on their own and maybe through key partnerships. But, we have very strong sister companies and shareholders within our ecosystem that will allow us not to focus too much on having to maintain an AVM or having to build out a mortgage origination flow or worrying about how to handle insurance. Those are all companies that we are partnered with. They're sister companies of ours, and we are working with them to be able to plug them into our platform. So it means that we can scale and we get the benefit of focusing on the core, which is search and lead generation, without having to worry about the peripheral elements that, they add tremendous value. It's consumer engagement, it's stickiness of the platform. And those are very useful. And luckily for us, we don't have to go and build it all. We can just partner with existing companies from our shareholding infrastructure.
So it gives you a bit of a leg up. It saves you from wasting time and brings additional functionality to the business.
Correct.
One of the things so one of the things, Theo, you mentioned before, which I wanted to explore, was you wanted to provide additional value to the agents, the advertisers. Are you doing stuff around mortgages and tying that in, giving them better access than because you've got to do something different from the competitor?
Yeah, not as yet. For now, we are just running as a pure portal player, but the time will come quite soon where we start integrating some of that. We believe that in South Africa it takes on average 3 to 4 months to transfer property, and within our ecosystem we've got so much depth within the other verticals, especially the key ones, where it takes time. So, for example, you can get a pre-approval in 3 minutes now for a mortgage, and 95% of the time that pre-approval holds up. So if we plug that on top of our platform, the portal now, it means that the consumer that's browsing the portal has got a 95% guarantee that whatever pre-approval we give them will end up being honored by the banks. And that's something that, our competitor would build it out, but it's going to take them a considerable amount of time and effort to get to that point. So I think that we might be behind on certain aspects, but once we start plugging in this, let's say the rest of the ecosystem onto our platform, I think we can leapfrog in certain aspects of, this game.
I'm interested. So you mentioned there that Better Home Group is a major shareholder in private property, but I think about 2 years, 18 months ago, there was a big shakeup of the industry in South Africa. One of the very few examples that I've ever covered of a competition authority actually having teeth and imposing things on real estate portals. To kind of sum it up quickly for people, essentially the competition authority in South Africa came down very hard on the two leading portals in South Africa, Property 24 and Private Property, and imposed a whole bunch of different things. But one of those things was that private properties, let's say, unique partnership with large national real estate agencies via a relationship with industry association, I think called Rebossa, right? Had, in the words of the commission, allowed it to secure a majority of listings and create barriers. And they made a whole bunch of your shareholders divest. Am I right in saying? Now, we could talk about this particular piece of news for a while, but how, broadly speaking, had the competition authority's judgment affected business for you? I imagine it was quite a shock to read that report, right?
Yeah, it was. But, the irony of it is, I think the unintended consequence of the remedial actions that we're proposing meant that we had to have across the board more equitable pricing. So in actual fact, I think an unintended consequence is that the portals, specifically the market leader, would make more money because, there was these long-term contracts that were in place with lower rates. And, the way that this market works, it's on a pay-per-lead model. And, a big national player that was getting a lot of leads would pay less per unit lead than, an agency, small agency with 5 listings that gets, 10, 20 leads would pay more. But as a result of this, that per lead pricing has had to be normalized, which means that the big guys will pay a lot more and not
Right.
necessarily little guys paying less. So that's kind of the unintended consequence of that. And from our point of view, from a shareholding point of view, so it wasn't Rebossa, you said Rebossa, but it was it was called the EAPPC, the Estate Agent Portal Company, which a grouping of agencies had call it a minority stake in our business. And, they had to divest, which happened more than a year and a half ago now. And that's been okay for us. Of course, it helped us for some time to have the support of the industry, but we have to fend for ourselves, which is why we just focus on giving value and building the right product, and growing market share organically over time. We definitely would love to have people come en masse, but we understand that we have to do it gradually over a period of time.
Okay. Handle with a straight bat. I want to go back to your time at Naspers. So one of the big reasons that I wanted to get you on was because you have built real estate portals remotely in other countries that have worked. Now that's incredibly rare. That doesn't normally happen. Normally when somebody tries to build a real estate portal remotely without going to that country, it doesn't work. Could you maybe give us a rundown of a few of the real estate portals that you have helped build remotely that have actually done well?
Well, I think, when you say remotely, the majority of the remoteness of our operation was always product and technology, call it the heartbeat of the portals that we built. But we worked in markets like Russia, launching Domofon there in 2014, 2015. We don't speak Russian. You can't support Russian. We can't market in Russian. So we had to have, it was a JV between Property 24 or the entity above Property 24 and Avito. And we had to have, marketing teams, sales teams, support teams on the ground in country. So it might look remote, but the reality is those kinds of operations, you can't sell if you don't understand the culture and how things operate on the ground. You can't sell remotely. So it's best you have sales divisions, marketing units. You've got to also understand the nuance of language. We did a lot of the translation for the platform using the, Russian embassy in Cape Town. They helped us to do the translation and things like that. But once we got people on the ground, they also said, okay, this translation could be stronger and helped with that kind of stuff. But for the cultural elements, real estate has always been a relationship business and will always for the, foreseeable future be that. And so you need to have people on the ground to go speak to the customers, engage with them, find out their pain points. When I say customers, I mean agencies. So that's super important. And, somewhere like the Philippines, we were a little bit lighter touch. That was also a JV with a company that used to be called Sulit, and Property 24 then was a an experiment which ended up being a very strong component for the revenue for that for that country, for the business. And yeah, we did that remotely as well, but again, sales support teams on the ground. But a lot of the strategic thinking and product execution came from South Africa, where we had our team.
So these were all joint ventures then. So one of the questions I had was, how do you pick where you're going to do it? Because, Russia and the Philippines, they don't, to my mind, have anything really in common. Is it just low-hanging fruit, like markets where there's not a strong vertical player that you looked for joint ventures, or, what was the criteria for it?
Well, joint ventures helped us in those markets where we needed to have an operation on the ground. But there were others like, Property 24 in Kenya, for example, or Mauritius, where we just launched the portal, did some marketing, and it was kind of self-service for a while, so people could onboard themselves, and it was very light touch. There we just went in ourselves and did everything ourselves, did a bit of marketing remotely. But, the big markets where there's big chunks of revenue to be had, and we wanted to move a little bit faster, then we looked for partnerships where it made sense. And of course, due to Naspers' footprint, it just helped that they had businesses in those territories that we wanted to enter. But we'd done we called it internally a global scan, where we looked at countries based on population growth, GDP, a bunch of other factors. We looked at maturity of the real estate market, in terms of legislation. And we then had, a bunch of countries that we thought we could go into. And I think we did a pitch at some point whereby, there was decisions that needed to be made around 2016, 2017. And yeah, at that point, Process made a decision that, they wanted to back a different portal coming from another part of the world. I think it was Storia. And, they built it from the ground up and opted not to use the engine from South Africa, which I believe, was a mistake. They should have taken the engine from South Africa and put that down globally. It was more mature and they didn't need to build from scratch, and it had success in big markets. And yeah, that's unfortunate that they chose that route. But yeah, they could have done a better job in terms of putting down more portals in the markets that they were interested in using the better engine.
So we're in this fortunate position of where we can look back in time and see how well those decisions panned out. So at least there's an upside of getting old. Okay. And one of the things that it's interesting is we look back and you launched a bunch of these sites back in, was it 2000 and, was it 6, 7, 8?
I'd say South Africa was the rebuild of Property 24 in South Africa, 2009. And then 2012 was the Philippines, 2013, 14 was Russia. Okay. And then, the same year, probably 16 other markets in Africa. So Kenya, Nigeria, right, Ghana, Namibia, Mauritius, etc. There's a few others.
Okay, so we're a decade on from that point in time. Now let's sort of look back. So Domofund is still in Russia, still operating, but not a market leader.
Yeah, they actually folded it back into Avito, so it's not a vertical anymore. It's part of Avito, and they're building out the horizontal, but verticalizing the real estate segment and maybe the auto segment to compete with the verticals in that market. Again, different strategies and different people involved now. So those are the decisions they've made. But my opinion is they should have kept the vertical and doubled down on it, because Tian is doing very well. And there's others, like the Spurbank offering, etc., that have come into the market.
Yep. And what about these other markets you launched? So what was the brand in the Philippines?
It was called Property 24.
Okay.
And then it was sold back to the OLX group. And I think that they also shut it down and put everything back into the horizontal.
Okay. And what about in the other African markets? How when you look back at the kids that you created back, and now they're growing up, how are they performing?
Performing well, I'd say, still going strong. The challenge is super early stage markets, right? So very little monetization, but it was good to just have a presence there and let it churn. So they're still running, they're still going. I think it also helps, the poor company with branding when people are moving countries, etc. Having a presence in those areas where people are moving from. But yeah, I guess I'm not sure what their strategy is with them now. But if I look at Kenya, for example, which is a little bit more mature, it seems like it's still on autopilot. They're not looking to execute a decent strategy to extract value from that market. I think they're happy to just watch it tick over.
So what would be the 3 key lessons you learned in that process? If you were to go back in time, would there be 2 or 3 things you would do differently to get a better outcome?
So if I could go back in time, I think I would have maybe pushed harder and tried to ensure that the engine that I was a part of building ended up being the chosen option to be deployed in more mature markets, instead of a different operation from a different division of the process group. That's definitely one. 2, I think that for some of the markets, like we looked at Indonesia, for example, and we actually got to the point where we uh, signed a lease on a premises for an office, but never ended up executing and putting down the portal. I think we could have, knowing what I know now and going back 10, 12 years, I think would have been a bit more bullish and put down more of these portals in some of the markets that we thought could have made it, because, having the advantage of hindsight, right? Knowing what has happened and how it's kind of played itself out. I think we're early stage. There was a lot less competition then than probably now. It was a lot easier to get going. So we could have definitely made greater headway had we put down more portals in a few more strategic markets. And then lastly, maybe the ones that were working, we should have doubled down on them. So like Domofon, for example, we went from 0 traffic to 8.5 million users in 13 months. And at that stage, Cian was at about 6 million users a month. So it was a big growth. And I think that Cian was very, 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 very strong in Moscow and the main cities, and Avito and Domofon was strong externally. And we should have just doubled down on growth in the key focus areas. And it would have been an interesting battle that would have lasted longer. Not that Avito is not successful, they are, but it would have been nice to see that vertical become market leader. It was from a traffic point of view, but from monetization, it wasn't.
Yeah, actually, what's interesting in the Russian market is Cian is still very strong, clear market leader in that sort of Moscow region area, which is the main region you want to own. In the St. Petersburg area, it's a big old fight between Avito and Cian. Competition is the best way to put it. And then in the regions, it's far more Avito, and Cian is more of a distant player in those markets. So what's interesting is that once you've established a market leadership position, it's pretty hard to lose it unless you do something wrong in that process. So a couple of thoughts. If and I want to pick up on 2 things. One is you're talking about you should have put down more markets. Now, a company that went off and did that was Lamudi, right? They were with the Rocket Internet guys, and Kian and this other gentleman who I can see his face. I can't remember his name from meeting them in their office in Berlin, or 10, 12, 14 years ago, wherever it was. They raced around the world. They did a similar strategy. And then we sort of, play the movie, and it all got sold off or closed down for bits. Part went to EMPG. EMPG picked up a chunk of it. That then part of it got sold off to Lifeful Connect, which was the Mexican business. DCG picked up, the Digital Classifieds Group out of Australia, picked up Indonesia and the Philippines. in that process, and other big, I think basically everything else got closed down in that process. So do you think, if you look at what happened to them, would you still run around and put down more of these Property 24 sites in other markets? Or would have you focused on maybe 2 or 3 markets and gone really deep and really efficient?
Yeah, so strategically, pick the markets. That's what I would say, Simon. So I think Lamudi was a spray and pray. They had 50 countries at some point, maybe more, if I'm not mistaken. And, it becomes hard to keep your pulse on what's going on in every single one, especially if you're doing it all remotely. If you've got, 5, 6 countries that you're focused on, it's a lot easier. You can be in 20, but your core focus is on the 5 or 6 big ones. And also put down, as I mentioned right in the beginning, if you partner with people on the ground that can actually do the operation, then, you just focused on the more strategic things. And then, customization. So Lamudi had pretty much the same engine in every single territory they were in. But if you looked at, Domofond versus Property 24 in South Africa, they're completely different platforms. And 100% customized for the Russian audience and what their expectation was. And I think that was the secret sauce, why it worked so well. If we'd just put down a clone of the South African platform, it definitely wouldn't have gotten as much traction as it did.
So the concept of, Ed, the concept of one of these sort of one size fits all, you're saying doesn't really work, and that you really need a high level of customization for each market based on all the although the core is the same, right? Search, look at listings, engage with a listing, generate a lead. Listings come from CRMs. That's everywhere in the world works the same, but it's the 1%ers around the outside that are the nuances that are the difference between make and break of the success of these portals.
Yeah, the nuance is where I think a lot of energy has to go. So for Moscow, for example, walking distance from a metro is an important thing. And the portals, Xi'an has had that since 2014. And we had that when we launched in 2014 as well. Those kinds of features, which are now a lot easier to do now, a lot of energy went into building that. Travel time. So you could see, okay, I walk 15 minutes to the metro, I jump on the green line, I stay on the ring, and then I stop at my station. And it calculated all of that, including the metro time, etc. So you could see I'm living an hour and a half away from the office. You could do that 10 years ago. So, and that level of customization was not necessary for South Africa because it's a completely different landscape where people still today search based on suburbs. Travel time, etc. is a factor, but it's not a core search pillar. So definitely customization for the market. You've got to pay attention to that. And you can't use the same template in, a Russian market that you'd use for Philippines, etc. But I think for some cases you can get away with it. I would think like Portugal, Spain, Italy, you could probably have the same template and customize for language across those markets. But maybe, the UK, Russia, maybe even Dubai, you can't have the same template across those countries.
Okay, I want to, speaking of different countries, there's another country that you've worked in. In 2018, you left South Africa to take over Hepsi Emlak, or Hurriyet Emlak, I think it was called back then. How did that come about? How does someone move from South Africa to Turkey? What's the connection there?
Well, the family behind, the group that owned Hepsi Emlak, the Dawn group, I think they were looking for a tech-led CEO. They come from a media business, largely. And when they looked around the world and looked at portals that have come out of media businesses and made a success in the classifieds, there's a few players that stand out there, with the Naspers operation being one of them. And then also they had a business in Russia. They owned a small business. It was actually the number 4 portal at the time in the Russian market when we launched Domofon. So they looked at, hey, these South African guys coming out of media are putting down portals around the world. And, they got in touch, and ultimately we came to a meeting of minds. And yeah, it was an interesting challenge for me to go to a new market that was a bit different to the markets that I'd worked in. And, it was a different challenge for many reasons. Like working in market, in country. I moved to Istanbul. I worked with a fantastic team of the guys at Hurriyet Emlak, but majority of the guys at the time didn't speak English, so communicating with the business was a challenge for me. I learned a little bit of Turkish, but to be able to help to have conversations. And the things that I took to that market was everything that I'd learned in the territories that I'd been a part of prior. And one of the stories I always tell about Turkey is, for example, I met a gentleman by the name of Murat Goldstein, who was the founder of Remax Turkey. Remax Turkey had been running for 25 years when I moved there. And in my third month, I went to go and visit him. And he asked me what I was doing there, because in 25 years, he had been subscribed to 4 portals in the market, and not a single person, not a sales guy, not a admin guy, not a CEO had ever made contact with him at the time. So, just that understanding that real estate is a relationship business, taking that knowledge and applying it there, I think is what yielded results and helped Emlak start to turn the corner. Of course, they've got a very formidable competitor there, and the battle's still ongoing. But they've been growing from strength to strength and doing great work.
Okay. Were there any kind of really notable similarities or differences going between South Africa and Turkey? We've been talking about how, these markets are so nuanced, and, you really have to pay attention to these nuances. Was there anything kind of unexpected in terms of a similarity or a difference? You mentioned there the anecdote about, no one's gone to see this guy who's one of the main customers.
Yeah, so there was similarities, but, Turkey underwent regulation during my tenure there. So that was a similarity, because we went through the same in South Africa maybe 10 years prior. So yeah, the real estate market being regulated, the way that agencies work, agencies forming into a brand, brand going up to a franchise, etc. Very similar. And then, the way that it operated, largely, except for payments, only 3% of properties were mortgaged versus, 50% or more in South Africa. So that's a big difference. But otherwise, the operation's quite similar.
Okay. So you came back to South Africa in 2022. Am I right?
Correct.
And you've been in charge of private property since then. One thing I noticed about private property, which struck me as, I guess slightly odd, was that having built an AVM yourself, private property doesn't have an AVM, or it didn't when I did the research for this at least. You've built an AVM. What is your kind of opinion on how useful they are or are not for a real estate portal? And again, is that something that is not a generalization, but is specific to each market?
Yeah, I think it's specific to each market. It might not be relevant for some markets, but for this market, I think it's very much relevant. The AVM plays the part of educating the consumer. So giving them all the information they need about a property or an area ahead of time, so that they can make a more informed decision. So with private property, as I mentioned, we are rebuilding everything from the ground up. Luckily, in AVM, we don't have to build ourselves. One already exists in the ecosystem we work within, a product called Loom, LOOM. And we're looking to, in the near future, plug it into our platform to be able to leverage the data that they've got, and also infuse some of our own to build something unique and launch it to the market. So it's good to have property trends and things like that, but the consumer wants to know, what's happening with that specific home that they're interested in. So it would be good for us to play a catch-up game and put that in quite soon.
So it's in the pipeline then?
That's something that we're physically looking at. It's just all Prioritization. When you have 1,000 things to do, you pick the most important 5 and you go for those. So that's kind of where we are at. But yeah, the AVM and valuations and trends data, that's hugely important for us, and it's high up on our agenda.
Okay, speaking of the agenda, you don't have to give too much away. I'm sure the competition are listening. What are some things that private property is working on at the moment that are really exciting for you?
Well, we can safely say the AVM is coming soon, right? And then it makes sense that in the near future, we build out our ecosystem and start to plug in some of our partner businesses, mortgage businesses, insurance. We think that there's some stuff we can do for the consumer to make their search a little bit easier. We're looking at that. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we want to do in terms of adding to the stickiness of our platform, and also, giving more data to the consumer, empowering the agents with more information about, what's going on around their property and information on the consumer that's looking at it. So those are the elements that we're looking at. That
Okay.
I can.
Yeah, that you won't get in trouble for mentioning. Cool. Theo, I just have one final question for you. As somebody who's been around in the industry for as long as you have been, we've already been through your stellar CV. What is the thing that, in your opinion, the industry doesn't talk enough about? Because there's all kinds of things that we do talk about, and the really interesting stuff tends to be the things that actually we don't talk about enough.
Well, I think, a lot of it has become quite clinical, what we speak about. The conversation is around, AI, automation, etc. But real estate is and always will be, about human beings. So it's not about lead generation. It's about a home that, people that are looking for a home for their family, etc. So I think we've forgotten the human element of what we do, and we rely a lot on, algorithms and ways of us to be able to optimize this thing that we're doing. But the human side is super important. I think, a real estate purchase, at least in the markets I've worked in, is usually the biggest financial transaction that 99% of people will do in the markets that I've been in. And as a result of that, there's a lot of fear around, fulfilling the transaction, making a mistake, etc. And we play the role of enabling them through information. The agent holds their hand, but we're there to facilitate information so that they make the best and most informed decision for their journey, and hopefully we get it right. So I think sometimes we just forget that it's human beings that are trying to go through this process.
Okay, yeah, that's quite a good answer, I would say. Theo, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We always appreciate when busy CEOs like yourself on a big mission can take the time to share what they're doing. I'm sure we'll see you soon enough at a PPW event.
Certainly, I think 6 weeks from now, roughly. So I'm looking forward to that.
Be great to see you there. So anyway, there is a South African contingent coming. So there we go. They're coming from around the world.
+1.
+1.
Yeah.
Make sure you register. Like everyone else out there listening, 6 weeks from now, we've got a PPW conference in Bangkok. We're talking about this sort of topics, the future of marketplaces, the future of prop tech. And if you want to meet Theo or you want to meet other C-level leaders from around the world, you better be there. Register on www.ppwapac25.com.